Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. Welcome to another edition of Black Focus. I'm your host, Ron Edwards, coming to you from the corporate studios of MTN, the Minneapolis Television Network, here in Northeast Minneapolis, if you will. Hey, we can see some parts of the sky, and they say it's going to maybe even get better in a couple days. November was, you hate the expression, was a dark month. Only 2 days, as we talked about on last week's program, only 2 days in November that we was clear. Kind of makes you wonder what's going on. I think a lot of this has to do with all these fires. And, there were big fires burning up in Canada, but we all know what was happening in California, some parts of Arizona, some parts of New Mexico. That's a lot of soot, a lot of smoke, if you will, in the sky. And by the way, it's not healthy for us. A piece came out about a week ago, and it had to do with the fact, and no one, all the experts cannot explain it, that in the last 3 years, the United States has seen longevity decline. In other words, life expectations decline. Now, it makes you wonder how in the heck that could happen with all of the powerful, institutions, quality of life. Oops, that also means quality of life is decreasing also, something we don't want to talk about, particularly as, the cost of living goes up, if you will. People are paying more, and people are affording less, particularly the affordable housing issue. Maybe one of these days we'll be able to find somebody in the city government who will come in and visit with us, sit here in this lovely setup that we have here, if you notice, and talk to us a little bit about, really what's happening in affordable housing. Can people really afford affordable housing? What is affordable housing? Let's take a look as if it was a line item, if you will, because when I keep seeing these camps springing up, and I just talked to an associate of mine who is on the West Coast as we speak, traveling, hadn't been in some Pacific cities on the West Coast, cities that, are considered to be Minneapolis-like, if you will. Portland, Oregon, Sacramento, San Francisco. San Francisco, the most expensive city in the United States. Phoenix, if you will, Salt Lake City, Utah, places like that. And we had a long discussion early this morning on some other matters, and they were saying just how many homeless camps there are on the streets of San Francisco. On the streets of Oakland, California, Richmond, California, going up towards Sacramento. They say Sacramento, which used to be a beautiful city. I used to travel there on corporate business and et cetera back in the day when we were an executive, quote unquote, at Northern States Power Company, now called, the Montana Company. I'm just joking, but we were for over 20 years an executive with Northern States Power Company. We saw a lot of things. We're involved at the very top of the mountaintop, if you will, assistant to the president of Northern States Power back in those days, headed its fuel assistance program, $30 million venture, if you will. We're talking back in the day. We're talking 20-some years ago and et cetera. But back to the affordable housing situation, I just see too many people, particularly in a city like Minneapolis. Well, let's just say the state of Minnesota, the Twin Cities and et cetera. We do not have the best of climate per se in the wintertime. It gets inclement pretty quick. And we're looking at the slowness of dealing with the homeless camp there in South Minneapolis. But associates have told me that, man, you haven't seen any homelessness until you've seen what's going on in California. Again, San Francisco, Oakland, Richmond, Sacramento, and et cetera. And it's scary because it's the children who are so affected by these circumstances. There's this absence, if you will, of quality of life because, good, safe, affordable housing is about the quality of life, if you will. We always like to pretend that we're not a third world country, but when you go into certain neighborhoods, communities, and etc., you would have a hard time making a person make a bet that those communities don't look like a third world nations. Absence of stores and etc., good public service and etc. And so we aren't surprised what we're hearing from different places around the United States about this affordable housing, homeless issue. You know, all you need is to get into a situation where you've got 8, 9, 10, 15,000 people homeless, and they decide to do what they're doing in France right now, if you will. The so-called orange shirts, green shirts, individuals, workers, and etc. We're not talking about people that are freeloaders in this conflict that's going on in France. We're talking about people that get out and work every day, if you will, are the heart and soul of the activities and the generation, if you will, of activities and quality of life. There we are again in France, if you will. Macron, the French leader, had to go on national television the other night to indicate that they were going to, up wages, cut taxes, etc. I don't know if he'll be able to deliver. The French people are beside themselves with anger and frustration. Then we have Brexit. I love doing this. I love watching BBC and watching, because I like the way that parliamentary government works. We probably really need it in this country. We would probably have a greater participation of the so-called base, if you will, and there's just more than just Donald Trump's base. Parliamentary form of government requires individuals to be able to state their position, if you will, to articulate, to talk with a level of specificity, detail, and etc. You got some people in the Congress of the United States that serve 2 or 6 years, or 12 years, and 18 years, and etc., who never utter a word. All they do is push a button to vote or exercise or express their vote. And I've known for many years as one that thinks that the art of communication, if you will, is a beautiful thing. The ability to be able to articulate your position, your thoughts, to draw reflections from others, and etc., is so important to communication, because we don't communicate very well. We've said on this program a couple of times over the last couple of years, I'm beside myself with regards to the number and amount of commercials. You have a 59-minute program, and you have 27 minutes of commercials. I mean, it's gotten so bad that if you time it, you have 6 minutes of the program, 5 minutes of commercials. In some cases now, depending on how many people that are doing advertisements and etc., you could have 6 and 6, 7 and 7, 9 and 9. I mean, it's kind of scary. It's even beginning to happen in sports. It used to be that in sports, the commentators at the halftime and etc., we're not talking about a timeout and etc., would to talk about the game and talk about the sport and talk about what was going on, positive or negative, and etc. You notice now when they go to break, there ain't no talking about the game. It's talking in terms of what kind of opiates you should be buying, what kind of car you should be driving, what kind of plane you should be flying on, what kind of dog food, cat food, and etc. you should be buying. And so we are really very narrow as human beings in our real scope of understanding. That's why I'm happy that we are commercial free here at MTN, because man, nothing severs a meaningful conversation, a conveying of information, and etc., is to have a 4.5 minute break to do a soap commercial and etc. And that's one of the things, by the way, way back in the day when cable was coming into Minneapolis and the negotiations were beginning. Yes, I was a part of those negotiations. In fact, my name is on the articles, quote unquote, of affiliation and et cetera, along with a very, very good friend of mine, Larry Blackwell, one of the great public officials, 19 years, the affirmative action director for the city of Minneapolis. Larry now is finishing up as general counsel for the Army Corps of Engineers, if you will. Just a great individual, great person, very smart person, and a man who did a wonderful job for the city of Minneapolis in helping, city government understand the importance of what we call now diversity and such things. That it was, back in the day, it was affirmative action, opportunity to get a place at the table, if you will, et cetera. So we wanted to touch on some of that, particularly after our conversation with associates on the West Coast early this morning, talking in terms of the homeless camps. We repeat again, a little redundancy, but that's okay. We repeat again. People making reflections about how tough it is. People living in filth and et cetera. In fact, I'll tell this one and make it as appropriate as. Yesterday, an associate was telling me they were in San Francisco. They were on their way to a facility and et cetera. And a woman right there in broad daylight in the street, pulled her pants down and urinated into, a drain, if you will. Wiped herself, pulled her pants back up, and walked on about her business, if you will. And at first I, was appalled when I heard it, but then I remembered something about how many places I see nowadays. I mean, we are so insensitive to the needs of each other. How many businesses I see now that have little signs posted, these are not public restrooms. Now, maybe we should do what they do in Europe, where they do have public toilets, if you will. Particularly the major enterprising cities of Europe, starting with Paris and London and Prague and Berlin, if you will, and Rome and Madrid and Lisbon and et cetera, Athens and et cetera, where you have public toilets, where you can go in and relieve yourself. A lot of people are uncomfortable about these kinds of discussions, but maybe that's the reason that we aren't doing as well as we should with regards to the problems that face our societies and et cetera. But yes, the woman did, if you will, and went on about her business. And I thought that probably, given how San Francisco has become the home of the rich, with everyone trying to dismiss all of that poverty and homelessness on the streets of San Francisco. Like I said, there is no place in America more expensive than San Francisco. And my associates who are there right now confirmed to me as an example that, chicken wings, if you will, a small plate of chicken wings at the top-notch places there along a marketplace and all of them, $16. $16 for a small plate of chicken wings. I mean, I know chickens, eat a lot and are demanding, but I mean, come on, man. But you have that same price in the People's Stadium, the quote-unquote $1.345 billion football stadium sports facility where we'll be having the Final Four in April. Tacos, going for $9, $10, $12, but chicken wings are going for $16, $17. If you're a father married with 2 children and you decide that you're lucky enough to get tickets to a professional sports event, let's say the Vikings, you'll spend, parking included and et cetera, you'll spend close to $500, maybe as much as $700, depending on where you sit, if you will, in the stadium. And I'm like, wow, we are in many regards pricing ourselves right out of the Coliseum. We will be at a place where we will sit and be absolutely controlled by television, if you will, the controlled communication, and et cetera, because folks won't be able to enjoy life. Again, the issue of quality of life will not be able to enjoy that. And consequently, their children and their heirs, if you will, those that will come after you will not be able to enjoy it either. And so these are some thoughts in the first 10, 11 minutes of today's program to try to give us a feel, because there are just a lot of things that are happening that people aren't talking about. I say to the executive director here at MTN, God bless the agreement and the existence of MTN, if you will, to deliver a message, uninterrupted, by the way. Now, let's go to a couple of items that were not really being discussed, and the media chose to keep a lid on it for whatever reason, if you will. It started on Friday, though the Minneapolis Star-Tribune one of their columnists did a beautiful article on the activities that took place that Friday night, led by Nekima Lebe Pounds Armstrong and some others. But it was Nekima and that really spoke to the proposition and et cetera. Children were there. In fact, there was a picture in the Minneapolis Star-Tribune showing a child, if you will, a first grader at Lucy Laney, or one of the schools, decorating the tree. You know, the tree has become quite a controversy in our beloved city. It appears that some people in the MPD thought that the tree was something to disrespect some segments of the community, with, I don't know, malt liquor, Popeyes cartons, and I mean, just it was clearly a part of people that are decadent, if you will, in their thinking. Two police officers in question are assigned to desk duty. Star-Tribune has done a nice job of uncovering some scary, frightening kinds of information on these two officers, but it's probably not as bad as the two that they're considering to bring in to the 4th Precinct, if you will. We even got a guy named Wild Bill. Neither one of them particularly care for African Americans, so I kind of wondered the question, why do you put them in command of the 4th Precinct, where at least 45% of the population there in the so-called 4th Precinct, North Minneapolis and et cetera, live, if you will. But I guess I guess you should be just happy to be alive and be served, whatever that means. But anyways, that was on Friday, this past Friday. That was a lovely occasion. The leadership, Nekima Lebe Pounds Armstrong and others who assisted her, should be commended. They also raised some tough questions, if you will, about the direction of the 4th Precinct, the direction of the MPD, and et cetera. And those are questions which I hope that people will respond to. A couple of issues are on the table that we're going to talk about for the remainder of this program. Number one, people saying that there maybe needs to be an advisory committee to the 4th Precinct. I don't think that's going to happen. You'll get strong resistance from the Police Federation, and they can do some things to shut things down. So it's going to take discussion around the negotiation table, and that is going to bring us to the next fiasco that happened 2 days later as it pertains to the 4th Precinct, the Minneapolis Police Department, the city of Minneapolis, its mayor, its city council, and et cetera. Now, on this one, you really weren't supposed to know about it, but Channel 11 really took an aggressive position on Monday evening in reporting on this and talking to some people that maintained they were the legitimate facilitators for discussions, negotiations, and et cetera, whatever that's supposed to mean. We had heard rumors even late Sunday here in our beloved Shangri-La that there were discussions, almost secret in nature, going on to maybe counter or create confusion. We want to be very specific, very detailed on this, because it has a lot to do with, really what is the agenda, to deal with this situation, this narrative of police-community relations. And so by Monday afternoon of this past week, yesterday, if you will, we're taping on a Tuesday, there were discussions about a meeting, some kind of meeting that was going to take place. And the purpose of that meeting was to receive, at some kind of actually Sunday meeting, some other community leaders. The Reverend Harding Smith, as an example, was one of those that had been identified as a mover and shaker, if you will. Harding Smith, who's been in Twin Cities maybe for, half a decade or whatever, close to the Castillo family, if you will, has been working with them for the last year, if you will. I think that they have funded or are funding some of the projects that Reverend Harding Smith is working on, if you will. And so conversation is that there would be a meeting at the 4th Precinct on, quote unquote, that Sunday evening. But the cover story that now has emerged, that as this group of African American leaders arrived, that the police would not open the doors, and even here for a brief moment at MTN, we were kind of looking puzzled as the conversation went on here in studio about, well, how do you cut out citizens, if you will, if you're talking in terms of being involved and trying to bring some order to the disorder, if you will, some trust to the mistrust, if you will, some consistency to the inconsistency, if you will. Well, what happened was, probably about 5:15, 5:30 that night or whatever, a delegation of leaders, if you will, led by the Reverend Harding Smith and others. A gentleman by the name of Kareem was identified as one of the new emergency leaders. Of course, as we said, Ms. Castillo. There were others of this specific group, and they had descended upon the 4th Precinct. Again, this was a Sunday, if you will. And the doors were not unlocked for them. Now, the cover story that the MPD is using at this particular hour is that sometime earlier in the day, as football games and things were going on, a Caucasian gentleman arrived at the station, demanded entry, was allowed to come in, and then allegedly began to curse and threaten, which is kind of interesting. I don't see an individual going into a police station threatening law enforcement and not be arrested and detained, if you will, for no other reason, a mental health examination, if you will. Boy, we got a lot of mental health money that's certainly floating around. Anyways, the individual allegedly was ignored. This was the cover story, that he was ignored by all of the officers and et cetera in the station. I don't know if acting Jose was on the premises, if you will. But the individual indicated that he was going to potty on the floor, if you will. He was going to defecate on the floor there, which should have led to something a little bit more official. But the cover story was the police told him the janitor would have to clean it up. They weren't going to clean it up if that's what he wanted to do. So allegedly he left. Now think about this. This was a Caucasian male. This is the cover story. And certainly, but the newspaper and the media did not cover that part. Now, a couple hours later, this delegation arrived, if you will. And one of the people with the delegation saw him right there on TV, on Channel 11, if you will, was City Councilman Jeremiah Ellison, if you will. City Councilman for the ward that the police station / precinct station is in, if you will. And so the officer, always basically a sergeant at the front desk, well insulated and etc., would not unlock the door, if you will. Now, the media had been alerted by this particular group of activists, if you will, to come, and they seemed to indicate that they were going to be directing that the media be allowed to view them as they negotiated with the MPD about a variety of issues and strategies and et cetera. Now, this is how this is developing at that point. Well, Channel 11 is the only one that really covered the story. It appeared in the manner which made it sound sensible, logical, believable, if you will. So the group headed by the Reverend Smith, if you will, demanded entry. Nothing happened. It appeared that no one came out from the police station. But let me tell you how well this was crafted, because Channel 11 showed the PIO officer, Public Information Officer, John Elder, who is also, this is interesting too, is also an elected public official in one of our suburbs where he lives, if you will. And Elder is shown, or a printed statement is shown, and Elder is shown, if you will, and it's clearly daylight, and it's clearly at the time in question, because there's snow and et cetera on the ground. It looks a little chilly. And then there are these quotes by the MPD that really challenge the honesty of this delegation led by Reverend Smith, and that included Valerie Castile, if you will, a gentleman by the name of Kareem, if you will, and some others. Kareem, in fact, an associate of an individual by the name of Matthew Ramadan, who has returned to our city, if you will, works for the city of Minneapolis. But the key was that, and then right after the picture of John Elder, the public information officer, was a picture of the acting supervisor, but at the same time the assistant chief of the Minneapolis Police Department, Jose, if you will. And Jose was, he wasn't saying anything, just showed a still picture of him, but then under his picture was that, they did not intend to be involved in situations in which it was just for the media. They had groups of individuals that they were going to talk to and to meet with. And that sounded familiar with a couple nights earlier on Friday night when the right kind of Christmas tree was put up in front of the precinct by members of the communities of every color and persuasion, led by a child, if you will. And what's more appropriate than a child shall lead them as it pertains to Christmas, if you will, the singing of carols and et cetera. Now, the group that was turned away became extremely agitated and et cetera. And the reason, I kind of know so much about this is that I was called on the phone by Reverend Harding Smith, and he asked me for a meeting. I don't know, I need a meeting. I'm just a journalist. I control no organization. I'm not affiliated with any organization, if you will, Urban League, NAACP, or et cetera. My time is absorbed with regards to the media, bringing forward information, knowledge, and et cetera. And so I asked the good Reverend, what could I offer? What was the reason for the call? This is a man, I think the last time that I had talked to him was probably 2 years ago, if you will. So I knew that there was some need, predicated on what, I wasn't sure. So I indicated to him that he needed to have this meeting. He wanted to meet with me. He wanted me to make an assessment of policing in North Minneapolis, and I then said, well, I assume you mean also the entire city of Minneapolis and et cetera. And the good Reverend said yes, and so he then indicated that he wanted a meeting again, and I told him, well, You never turn people down if you know they're irrespective of their motivations, that they are trying to deal with a problem that everybody is trying to deal with. And so I indicated that I could pencil him in on early Monday morning, that I would meet with him at a specific location, and that we could talk, and that I would make a determination of what value my knowledge and information would be to the good Reverend and his group of associates and et cetera. Well, I arrived at the particular location, waited about 10 minutes, if you will, because we were all busy, did not, of course, see the good minister, and so I called him. Obviously, I still had his number that he had called me from when he was in the car with some of the individuals, asking me for my assessment, keyword assessment. And so he answered, and at that point I said, the Reverend, I'm here at the location, I'm waiting for you. And then his voice kind of changed up, if you will. And he then said to me that whatever they meant, were going through a terrible situation, and that one of their parishioners had dropped dead earlier in the morning, if you will. And I thought, wow, well, it's terrible timing. So I indicated that I would have appreciated at least some notification about, that happening, if you will, and would not have wasted my time going to a location to meet with the good Reverend and whatever delegation of associates and supporters he was bringing. He said that, it was one of those terrible situations. I then did ask him the name of the deceased and what country the deceased was from, if you will. Reverend Hardy Smith is from the continent of Africa, if you will. Liberia, if I'm not mistaken. I well remember seeing him quite a bit on television during the very tragic situation with the Collins child and family and et cetera. Anyways, I told him that was sorry that we would not be able to meet, but that we could talk in about a month or whatever, because I already know that the plan of the mayor of the city of Minneapolis, Jacob Frey, is to begin some kind of dialogue to make it appear that there is an attempt to resolve some of this dangerous conflict that is present, because it's quite clear we are not, as a community and as a city, we're just not getting a handle on all of this conflict, if you will. Now, that brings us to last night. 3 individuals, one as young as 14, shot and wounded in front of Merlin's drugstore there on Lindale and West Broadway. Been there for many years. In fact, has just received some remodeling and et cetera, if you will. Merlin's does a lot of community business, if you will. Unfortunately, they apparently do a lot of business with far too many individuals coming in and involving themselves in transactions with opiates and et cetera, which is not good. Now, across the street is a Walgreens who, the assessment is, that Walgreens does a much better job with regards to handling opiates, pills and et cetera, because as we have reported almost exclusively here at MTN, we have far too many people dying. We're averaging 2-3 funerals a week now here in the African American community of people, young and old, who are dying from overdose, if you will. Those pills are not something to fool around with. It's nothing cute, if you will. It is extremely dangerous. And so something happened out in front of Merlin's drugstore there around, I don't know, what was it, probably around 5:30, 5:45. Gunfire breaks out, if you will. 3 African Americans are shot and wounded by gunmen. They really never apprehend anybody per se. The luckiest one was the youngest one, a young man, 14 years of age, was shot in the face, shot in the jaw. He is very, very blessed, very, very lucky. It was a through and through. Went through one side of his jaw, across, his tongue, probably knocked out a couple of teeth and went out the other side. He is going to survive. Other individual was shot in the knee, if you will, and the third individual was shot in the hip, There was video. People like to run out and take their video cameras and sometimes watch other folks in pain and misery. Sometimes I don't know if that's the best thing that you want to do, but that's what folks did. So for the last 14 hours or thereabouts, there's been almost now 18 hours, 20 hours. People have been on social media, as they call it, declaring that there is no end to the violence, if you will, now beginning to criticize the MPD, the just newly appointed chief, Medalla Arredondo, a young man that I've known for many, many years, ever since he came, even before he came into the department, growing up in South Minneapolis and et cetera. There's also family members that grew up in North Minneapolis and et cetera, a very large family. And so a lot of discussion going on as we are taping this we are also going live, aren't we, with Blog Radio and et cetera. We like that. A lot of discussions going on in and around City Hall. We had some associates indicate to us that they were at a meeting this morning in which it was a meeting of the City Council of Minneapolis dealing with the Chamber of Commerce and, productivity, if you will, success and profit as it pertains to downtown and et cetera. But some were of the professional opinion that they really weren't talking as much business as they needed. Now, they definitely need to talk a whole lot more safety for the citizens of the city of Minneapolis, as we talked about on last week's program and the week before that, as we talked in early and late 2017 and early 2018, the Super Bowl and et cetera, that it is important. Now, we'll have, I think the number is 90,000 guests coming to our beloved Shangri-La, the Minneapolis and St. Paul, to enjoy the Final Four, if you will, at the People's Stadium. Though, as we said earlier in this program, I'm not sure that many of the people can afford really to go to an event. Again, just going back for just a moment, or regressing, I talked to a person who had gone to their first Viking game, and they didn't buy them. They were given them by a friend who was a friend of a former Viking football player. And they were sitting in seats that, cost $400, man. I'm just from the old school. I used to go to the old Minneapolis Miller baseball games in the early 50s, and, a ticket for a kid, was 75 cents, $1.25 to sit close to third base. I mean, and even back in the days of the Minnesota North Stars and Minnesota Twins, when they were playing at the old Metro Stadium there, the Met, everybody loved that facility. We go see a game out there in the bleachers, if you will, for $2. You know what I'm saying? Man, them days are gone. I mean, it costs you now, what, $6, $7 for a hot dog? We talked about the chicken wings. Chicken wings, which, should be the cheapest commodity on the menu. I mean, $16, $17, $18 and et cetera. So I say all that to say that we are having these problems. And last night's shooting in North Minneapolis, which is one of many, it's not like this is the first shooting in 2018. I mean, we'd like to sit here and say that, but our executive director would not allow us to tell that kind of fake news here at MTN. And so we just have to indicate that the situation in Minneapolis has been the following since January 1, 2018. It was like that January 1, 2017, 2016, 2015, 2014, all the way back to Murderapolis. Is that there are shootings going on every night, and every other night somebody's being shot. If it's nothing more than a leg wound, an arm wound, a hand wound, and et cetera. And, I feel badly for those of our citizens, particularly in North Minneapolis, who try to go to sleep with the gunfire and wake up in the morning to the gunfire, if you will. And I'm like, wow, where do these guys get the ammunition? I mean, we know that no one's going to tell the truth about where they're getting the guns. And it's quite clear that the authorities are having, and this includes the ATF, that these guys are having a heck of a time finding out who is, marshaling, running, bringing in all of these guns. And I'm talking about state of the art. I can remember as a young guy coming up way back in the early 1960s that, basically the weapons of choice on the streets and et cetera were little short barreled 22s, if you will, with little bullets about that size, maybe a 32, if you will. God knows that if you had a 45 and et cetera, your uncle or your daddy had brought it back from Korea or the Second World War, or as we moved into Vietnam, because we were in Vietnam for so long, so much surplus weaponry came back into America that no one really wanted to talk about where it was really coming from. But nowadays, I mean, you got weapons out here, man, from the AK-47s, AR-16s, 15s. I mean, you've got weapons that not only does it put a hole in you, but it bounces around inside your body, basically destroying your internal organs and et cetera and et cetera. And I just keep wondering, where are these guns coming from? I mean, what the heck? Who is it that's bringing them in? Now, in the more private discussions, we know. I mean, we know where they're coming from. They're coming out of Chicago, if you will. They're being brought in and sold by cartels, if you will, by Asian gangs, by black gangs, if you will. But the key is that I don't know the last time that there's been a major bust here in the Twin Cities of any operation moving significant numbers of guns, if you will. And when I say guns, for the purposes of the program this afternoon, I'm talking about guns. I'm talking about long guns and handguns, Glocks and Tauruses and Smith and Westerns and, weapons that do severe damage. And then people talking on social media all during the night and into the early morning today here in Minneapolis, talking in terms of the age of the gunman that opened fire outside of Merlin's, shooting 3 individuals, if you will, and allegedly escaping. Maybe as we are recording this program this afternoon from the corporate studios of MTN, maybe a person has been apprehended. I don't know. Now, that doesn't even talk about the drugs. I mean, there is so much drugs, dope and et cetera, moving, as we said earlier in this program, through the communities of color and the white community, that it's scary. It's scary. You're kind of wondering, how is it that these pharmaceuticals, both the pharmaceuticals companies and et cetera, and the drugstores and the franchise drugstores, and I mean, how is it that they lose sight of all of these little pills, if you will, these opiates, these drugs, these combinations that are killing so many people? Even though he is leaving office, you have to give credit to outgoing Sheriff Rich Stanek, because 3-4 years ago, when he started saying to people after a couple of important people, popular people, I well remember a very beloved chef in uptown Minneapolis, if you will, white, if you will, because people get all hung up on the fact that it's only the coloreds, the blacks, that are involved in criminal enterprises and et cetera. We want to keep it real here at MTN, is that there are criminal enterprises everywhere, unfortunately for us, if you will. And so Sheriff Stanek had warned, and in fact for about 3 years, had been running a series of lectures and programs in everybody's community, because he came out into the African American community a couple years ago. He was at places like Turning Point, specifically International Ministries, if you will, some of the other black churches, and trying to get people concerned and alerted, key word probably, alert, to this drug epidemic that was just tearing communities apart, irrespective of, the color and the race of the community. And one kind of gets the feel as one watches the activity and the transactions and things that are going on that, man, it just ain't happening. I mean, I know from, listening to the homeboys, I grew up, quote unquote, on the streets of the city, that there's big money, with regards to illicit activities and et cetera. But, man, it looks like if we would get people jobs, legitimate jobs and et cetera, get folks involved in businesses and et cetera. Do you know with the Final Four coming up in April, do you know that we in the black community will not have a single franchise that be it cafe, if you will, motel, hotel, and et cetera, that will be able to facilitate and call itself a 2, 3, or 4-star or 5-star facility? African American community, man, it's just a game that's being played about the role. Now, let me go back a couple months. After the Super Bowl, which was a financial success as usual, there was an article in the Minneapolis Star Tribune. This is for those of you that have your computers and you work on your computers and et cetera, that there was a number that was the following, a profit, if you will, about $47 million. That after all the bills and everything were paid, that the city of Minneapolis and the state, if you will, were able to take a look at about $47 million. Now, we've had, since the Super Bowl, if you will, we've had individuals raise the question about, well, where'd the money go? Is there a breakdown? Will the host committee for the Super Bowl, and we would ask the same question of the host committee for the NCAA Final Four in April. Is there a breakdown of how the money was dispensed, if you will? What organizations and et cetera? I mean, was it the YW, YMCA, the Boys Club, Girls Club, if you will? Was it the home of the poor, if you will? Was it the house of salvation? I mean, who got that money? I mean, because what the article in the Star Tribune a couple of months ago, actually in the early spring of this year, it basically said is that all debt had been paid off and et cetera, and like I said again, about $47 million or more to the good, and so we here in these studios, MTN, Minneapolis Television Network, said for a couple of months, where'd the money go? And particularly in that we heard so much discussion by these host committees. The Super Bowl host committee did it. The Final Four host committee is doing exactly the same thing. I looked at their spokesperson here just a couple of days ago, and they were talking in terms of the volunteers. And that's the other thing. They certainly didn't have to really pay anybody other than the players and the owners, if you will, because the folks were volunteering. I mean, people just so happy to be tied into the Super Bowl, if you will, and then now the Final Four, and there'll be a couple of other smaller activities, events, and et cetera, that will bring in 15, 20 million. I mean, wow, And we always hear that the monies will be going to, it's whatever the local concern on the surface is. And right now it's the affordable housing and homelessness, if you will. So folks are saying, yes, money's going to go to the affordable housing, but also to the homeless. We're going to take care of them. We're going to build a facility. They're going to be able to go there, have warmth, warm food, and et cetera. I mean, the only persons that have come up with warm food and clothing and et cetera is the ecumenical community, and as far as government, the Minneapolis Fire Department, and kudos to the chief of the Minneapolis Fire Department for the placement of a big heat insulated tent so that human beings could come in and have a warm meal and etc. Now, we hope before we get one of those blizzards, though the Farmer's Almanac says that we're going to have a fairly mild winter, maybe a lot of cold but not a lot of snow. We just need to know where these folks can find a place to take a shower and bathe, clean their body, if you will. Make sure that their children are clean and etc., and see them off to school. And I just wonder how much education is really taking place for those that are confined to these facilities and etc. That always becomes a point of contention for those of you that follow the history, if you will, of displacement. Yes, people are displaced. They lose their homes. They lose their dignity. They lose their pride. They lose everything, if you will. And so we just think that at some point, and we here at MTN really have no problem with it, is that it needs to be talked about, if you will. If folks listen, then God bless them. And we feel that we are serving a purpose. If they don't, then we can all be guaranteed that we will suffer, quote unquote, the pain. And in some cases, as we're beginning to see in California, as we talked to you about early on at the top of this program, that we're beginning to see in California with homelessness and et cetera, we will begin to see a backlash, if you will. And so we are concerned about that. And we are concerned about the continued violence we don't see. Let me say this on this program this afternoon. We do not see, and we have been a long time activists, beside being a historian and other things, we have been very much involved in dealing with the social problems in an official capacity. I know folks like to talk about, we take these black folks and just keep them in a ceremonial role. Now, we have headed up, commissions, court appointed. In other words, the federal court appointed to oversee the fire department, to keep an eye on the police department, to deal with civil rights and et cetera. So we're not someone, by the way, that just happened to stumble up on the problem. We've known about this problem since, 1958, 1959, when a bunch of young black cats, if you will, founded an organization called PEP, People Employing People. We were young men, 19, 20, 21, 22 years old. We already had visions. We had great mentors and et cetera. We already had visions on what was going to be the success or the failure of our community as the sons and daughters of the African, the Negro, as we were referred to. So we've been there a long time, man. We fought that battle. We have reported, if you will, to the federal courts. We have been under the supervision in reporting to presiding judges, Judge Earl Larson, Judge Robert Renner, two great federal judges that made sure that this fire department here in Minneapolis got integrated. We almost had supervision of the Minneapolis Police Department until Tony Bouza came to town and said they were going to try to do the right thing. By the way, percentage-wise, the number and percentage of African Americans that have been hired and others of color, and by the way, we repeat this again on behalf of our Native American brothers and sisters, it is unbelievable the continued shrinkage, and the city council and the mayor and them need to really be concerned about this, of Native Americans to serve the Minneapolis Police Department, if you will. The fire chief has been doing a much, much better job, even though he's had to fight the same battles that the police department has had to fight. And in 2016 and 2017, we spent a lot of time in these studios, on the air, talking to you about what was happening and how applicants, if you will, of color were being denied the opportunity to become police officers, and then to a lesser degree, firefighters, though the current fire chief is tenacious in making sure that there is equal opportunity, representation, advancement, and et cetera in his department. We had a chance, we will not reveal the tenor of that conversation, we had a chance on Sunday to talk to the president of the Black Firefighters Association. There is a Black Firefighters Association. Unfortunately, the Black Police Officers Association was destroyed through a series of incidents involving a group of white officers, if you will. 5 of the black officers did sue, but won a $750,000 judgment against the city of Minneapolis for being discriminated against. But it was just the 5 of them. It was not a class action because too many of the black officers did not want to join with it, didn't understand the specificity and detail of the law. But those 5 officers, 3 who are still active in the Minneapolis Police Department as we move into the last couple of minutes. Our Chief Arredondo himself was one of the plaintiffs, Commander Charles Adams of the Minneapolis Police Department, and Lieutenant Hamilton of the Minneapolis Police Department. Lieutenants, well, at that time, Inspectors Lee Edwards, no relationship, and Don Harris. And we wish Don Harris the best in his battle, if you will, to overcome the mental stress and et cetera that he has been confronted with that caused him to take early retirement. This was Don Harris, former deputy chief of the Minneapolis Police Department, who left the service of the department a number of months ago. So we watch all these things. We hope that the leadership of the city of Minneapolis will pull together the necessary committees that they're talking about to deal with the issue of community policing and et cetera, because it also goes to the heart of the kind of violence that we saw last night on the streets of Minneapolis with 3 individuals being gunned down, if you will, in some kind of gun battle outside of Marlin's the drugstore there on the corner of Lyndale and West Broadway, if you will. We hope that our leaders can come together. By the way, we did not agree with the attack by the Reverend Gallman, who has returned to our city. We were saddened by his criticism of African American police officers in the tree incident. We may talk about that a little bit more next week. In fact, we may reach out to Reverend Gallman and ask him to join us here, if you will, on the couch, and talk a little bit about where he got his information that African American police officers did not stand up when the situation happened in the 4th precinct, if you will, which led to demotions and et cetera, and led to an interesting assignment for the moment of Assistant Chief Jose, who obviously Assistant Chief Jose made the decision the other day, a couple nights ago, that they didn't need to talk to another group of African Americans. My question now becomes, at what point will they have a real sit down, if you will? They will have a discussion and reflections and begin to come up with solutions and a plan to deal with this chaos. People in North Minneapolis and South Minneapolis they're really terrified, man, about the level of violence. By the way, I noticed that no one has been apprehended in the shooting of the 3 individuals in downtown Minneapolis, and particularly the 2 individuals that were damaged, if you will. Well, we're at the end. Let us never be referred to as that race or group of people because we didn't pay any attention to our circumstances and surroundings, that we're referred to as that race or group of people that have become extinct. God bless you, and on behalf of MTN, stay safe. Yeah, I heard that.
I hope you don't mind the Christmas.
Oh, I don't. Doesn't bother me. I was looking for you because I was thinking I was expecting the screen maybe to enlarge. We came in right on time though. We came in right on time. Yeah. Okay. No, they should.
Look good today. The opioids, fentanyl, comes from China. They got a loophole in their
Oh yeah,
in their
yeah, I know.
law. Then they just change it by a molecule, and then it's legal. Then they
Yeah.
change the law and then they just change it by a mile.
That's right,
It's
that's
legal.
right, that's
They're
right,
killing
yeah.
70,000 Americans.
That's
a year.
right, that's right, and then probably is many more. That comes from, yeah. Oh, man, okay, brother, what you up?